Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode in our special five-part series. Today, I am thrilled to have with me Kevin McCarthy. Kevin, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Tom, really happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Kevin, I wanted to visit with you today about non retaliation and protection for those who speak up. And I'd like to start with really maybe the basics. What is the importance of this topic in a best practices compliance program?
It is so critical. It's one of the three key pieces to any speak up program or whistleblower program. Obviously, you need something in place to encourage people to come forward. If there's anonymity built into it, you need to ensure that. And then there's the non-retaliation piece that is absolutely fundamental. Without it, you scare people away. Actually, what I wanted to do was talk maybe a little bit about. I've got 3 points I wanted to raise that I think are really part of the importance of it.
That's
Um,
great.
one, yeah, one being it encourages the reporting of concerns, one being legal and regulatory compliance, and the last one being reputational protection. And I think back to some of my government days. I worked in government before starting my own business. And I remember I had some dealings with some individuals who came forward as either whistleblowers or whatever term you wanted to use. And one of the most disturbing ones that I ever dealt with was a sexual harassment case. And it was quite rampant, quite serious. And the person who came forward with the complaint, and then the number of individuals who supported them in the complaint, they're all women. They said to me at the end of this, they said, you know what? If I ever had to go through this again, I would not have raised the complaint. And I would tell any young female to just keep your mouth shut, just put up with it, and hopefully it'll go away. And what happened in that case is this was a situation where we saw retaliation taking place, whether it was overt or what have you. It was almost like systemic. And it was an environment where these individuals could no longer work. They tried to do this anonymously to the extent they could. They could no longer work in that work environment with the people that they had been working with before because so much damage was done. So their view was it's best to just keep your mouth shut with these things. There's the perception of, and sadly it's because of what we watch on television or maybe going back to our schoolyard days, the perception of being a rat or a tail or a gossip or even betraying loyalties when you come forward to share something. It may not be a big deal. It may not be a complaint against someone. It could just be an indicator of something. And that's a really important piece that I'll talk about possibly a little bit later if we have time. You think about an individual who comes forward with a complaint, chances are they're coming forward maybe on the worst day of their life and they're second guessing and what's going to happen. Should I do this? Did I imagine this? Did I overplay this? The notion of having non-retaliation is so critically important, especially for those people who are doubting coming forward. They're doing the right thing. It's a really difficult thing to do. Employers have to have that non-retaliation protocol and process in place to make sure that you don't see people like the situation I described, people getting burned and saying, I don't trust this process anymore. It's all about the integrity of the process. And an alternative to not actually having the non-retaliation in place is you're going to have people walk away. They're not going to raise the issues. And then unfortunately down the road, you're going to see situations that could have been addressed at a much earlier stage. And sadly, they're not. And so that's the encouragement of people coming forward. And if you can get that non-retaliation in place, you can protect people. I did a little bit of research and I saw there's an interesting US Supreme Court case coming up in October. And it was a person named Trevor Murray versus UBS Securities. And it points back to Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, and this individual had filed a complaint of something really inappropriate in the securities world, was terminated, and have gone through various courts in the United States, making it to the Supreme Court in October, and it's a retaliation case. When these are out there, it's good that it's out there because it'll resolve the matter, but when these are out there, they can also maybe scare people away. I don't want myself exposed that way. I don't want to come forward. I think of legal and regulatory compliance as well, and I don't know that all employers are really motivated to do the right thing legally. Unless you get caught, unless you get burned, you don't really have any issues there. But simply put, these sorts of things like protecting against retaliation, it's written into law, it's written into legislation. You have In the United States, you have Dodd-Frank Act, you have federal whistleblower protection. In Canada, you have Public Servant Disclosure Protection Act, and then various state and provincial pieces of legislation as well that cover these things. So it's the right thing to do. And I think the only thing that maybe compels people is if there's an audit or an evaluation coming up, or certainly if there's millions of dollars at stake in a lawsuit or whatnot, that might compel organizations to do the right thing. But bottom line, it is the law in many cases. And the last thing I think about when I just think about the importance of non-retaliation programs is I think about just the reputational protection for an employer. If they're not compelled by doing the right thing to encourage people coming forward, if they're not compelled because it's the law, hopefully they're compelled by getting it right, getting the right protections in place might make you an employer of choice. You think of everything on social media where individuals can go and provide all sorts of information on employers. You could have all sorts of really bad information out there that you're an employer that doesn't protect people, that doesn't encourage people to come forward. That's the appeal I often make to employers is if the first two don't compel you to get it right and get non-retaliation in place, then just think of your own reputation as an employer and your potential loss of people, sick leave or whatnot, productivity-wise. So I know that was a long answer for a pretty simple question, but it's an exciting topic to talk about.
Let me ask you about retaliation itself. You mentioned clearly one form of retaliation, which is termination in the U.S. Supreme Court case. But retaliation can be both more invidious than simply termination and more subtle. So I was wondering if you might say a few words about how can we identify retaliation?
Oh, for sure. You know what? It's really interesting because it can be so incredibly subtle, as you said there. And I look at it typically from my experience, seeing it coming from three sources. I see it coming from peers or colleagues in the form of abuse, isolation, and exclusion. And sometimes it's on behalf of the employer, and sometimes it's the individual employees getting together and intentionally are not doing things. I see it coming from employers, and then I see it coming from industry. I'll give you a quick example of something I'd seen in my career. I'm in the Canadian capital, Ottawa, in the province of Ontario. Ontario is a very large province geographically. It's about 2/3 the size of Alaska, 1.5 times bigger than Texas. So it's a pretty big place. And so we have northern Ontario with a lot of small towns. And I remember a case where it was a true whistleblower, where the complainant worked in a very small office in a very small town, did the right thing by coming forward, and then saw just an incredible, I would define it as retaliation. I don't know that it was ever investigated that way at the end of the day, but they had their peers isolating them, no longer having coffee, social things with them. They're in a very small town. So you see it actually even spill out into the community, the small town, where everybody knows that's the guy that got the other person in trouble. It's as I said, it's social interactions, meetings. Sometimes it can be outright bullying and harassment, intimidation from the peers to the individual employee who had raised the concerns. From the employer themselves, it could be overtly harassing, bullying comments, whatnot, and little subtle things like performance management process and performance reviews, and the employer, the manager, taking action against an individual, saying their performance is no longer up to par. It's a pretty difficult to demonstrate. If somebody never performance managed someone in the first place, why do they all of a sudden start it? And can you actually say it's in response to, it's a retaliation? Managers go from 0 to 60 in terms of what they call it performance management after somebody has come forward with a complaint. See things like micromanagement. And one of the things I've seen is passing over the individual for opportunities. Very subtle. It wasn't your time for this opportunity. This other person is better suited for this because of their skills. Has nothing to do with your complaint. Denial of benefits, like a family leave, if something like that, where someone were entitled to that. Demotion, and we've seen the example of termination as well. And I was thinking about the definitions, and retaliation, it's got a really similar look and feel federally in Canada, US, provincial or state. Definitions are all pretty close, and they all kind of point to some sort of adverse action against a person that affects their employment or their working conditions because they did the right thing. So that's it. And the last thing, industry, I just talked about, small town situation, could be blacklisting. I live in Ottawa, nation's capital in Canada. It's 1 million people here, large city, but also considered a small town. I worked in government. Everybody knows everybody. Very quick and very easy for someone to spread the word to someone else that this individual is a problem. And so those are the things that I've seen happening, and it's quite disturbing, but it's real. And then it's hard to really prove things that these things are retaliation, but they certainly have a look and feel to it.
One of the, at least for me, key things that came out of the Me Too movement was that it's not simply the responsibility of the person who's harassed or discriminated against. It is everyone's responsibility. That means if I see something, I need to say something, whether it happened to me or not. And legally, we call those people bystanders.
Exactly.
How do we move to both encourage bystanders to come forward and, equally importantly, protect bystanders who do raise their hand and speak up?
Yeah, they are such an important part of this whole process. And they're in a horrible position at times because they may have seen something that they didn't want to see. You can't unsee it. They could have loyalties that are all of a sudden challenged there. So the way I look at it, obviously having really strong policies and consequences in place for if anyone were to violate retaliation against a bystander or any other individual, and having real conversations in workplaces. So it's wonderful to have policies, but then I always had this vision of middle managers and senior managers sitting down with their staff to talk about just why it is so incredibly important to raise things, even if they're just little things. It doesn't, my perfect world is somebody doesn't even realize that they're a whistleblower or a complainant. They just saw something that didn't feel right and they just pass it on to management to take care of. So those real conversations are things that I think need to happen. There's this perception of whistleblowers and speaking up, and I made reference to Tattletale and Rat. And my experience doing investigations is somebody's accused of something, and the first thing they want to know is they want to know who said this, who filed the complaint, who are the witnesses, and then they start working witnesses against one another as well. So it's to really demystify that and make sure everybody knows what the purpose of the thing is. And the purpose of the thing isn't to figure out who said what. The purpose is to, find out what happened and then how do you improve. And then there's this whole confidential reporting, investigation, and aftercare. So we have to make sure that we protect the bystanders, for sure, just like we protect anyone else, and make sure then through the process, the investigation process, things aren't unintentionally revealed by an investigator. I call it the procedural fairness dance. Give enough information, but don't give away everything. There has to be continuous monitoring, finger on the pulse after an incident, and then demonstrating you take action. Bystanders are huge. They're so important in the process, and they have to understand just what value they can add to making the place a better place. It's horrible when you're involved in a situation, whether you're a complainant, responding, or whatever. So get them to understand just how important it is, the protections that are in place for them, and those are my thoughts on that.
So, Kevin, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for our episode, but I wanted to ask two questions. One is if anyone wanted more information on Case IQ from their perspective, where might they go? And equally importantly is if people wanted to reach out to you directly to talk about any of the subjects you have discussed on this podcast, what would be the best way for them to do so?
Oh, fantastic, Tom. Thanks. So Case IQ, go to the website, caseiq.com. Again, caseiq.com. Amazing organization. I've actually had dealings with them for a bunch of years, and they offer great value in terms of products and also information sharing. And myself, just go to the website, integritybymccarthy.ca. Again, integritybymccarthy.ca, and you can easily get in contact with me. That's how you do it.
Kevin, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me. And I hope our listeners will join us for our next episode, where I'm joined by Jacob Fichtner as we take up triage and investigation of reports. Thanks again, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
All right. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.